Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. When President Trump was inaugurated, he spoke of a global war against Islamic fascism. Here's a clip of that.
And unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. We are protected, and we will always be protected. We will be protected by the great men and women of our military and law enforcement. And most importantly, we will be protected by God.
He later, a few days later, spoke at the CIA, where he talked about fighting this war without restraint.
We've been fighting these wars for longer than any wars we've ever fought. We have not used the real abilities that we have. We've been restrained. We have to get rid of ISIS. We have to get rid of ISIS. We have no choice.
Well, how is that strategy developing? It's hard to know, given that most of the media's attention is on James Comey and on ending soap operas that come out of the White House and the Russia effect, the Russia affair. But the real issues are what is going to happen with Trump's war, global war on Islamic fascism, which essentially means, or might it mean, a massive new increase in American troops on the ground and in the air in the Middle East. And maybe the first hint of that is the leak about 3,000 more troops going to Afghanistan. Well, now joining us to talk about this is Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College. He's the author of 20 books, including The Death of the Nation and the Future of the Arab Revolution. He's also the chief editor of Leftward Books and is a columnist for Frontline, Alternate, Counterpunch, and all kinds of places, and a regular on The Real News. Thanks for joining us, Vijay.
Thanks for having me.
So clearly Trump's plan was this global war against Islamic fascism. Steve Bannon was even put on the National Security Council. He got kicked off afterwards when McMaster came on, but he's still a chief strategist. And Bannon's vision of the world, and Trump certainly seemed to share it, called for a big military involvement in the Middle East. So are we seeing any sign of that? And what do you make of this leak about more troops going to Afghanistan?
Yes, I think that the expansion of the war from Syria on the one side to Afghanistan on the other is already in process. I think there's an error that people make in making these sort of divisions between, say, Trump's advisor, Steve Bannon, and McMaster, who's at the National Security Council. After all, McMaster is not a dove. He is not somebody who is not interested in escalating this war. He was one of the team of people who were the architects of the surge in Iraq. He served in Afghanistan, and he has called for a very long time for increasing troop involvement, both in the Iraq-Syria theater as well as in Afghanistan. Already we've seen big aerial attacks increase in Syria and in Afghanistan. We've seen the United States pledge to send more heavy weapons to the Kurdish Syrian fighters in northern Syria. And now there's this leak where the Trump administration apparently is considering sending 3,000 more U.S. troops. And when Trump goes to the NATO headquarters on May 25th, it's very likely that he's going to ask NATO countries to increase their supply of troops as well. Already Canada and Australia have indicated that they're open to sending more troops. So this is not merely an American expansion, but the Trump administration is eager to get its European and other allies to contribute a very large number of troops into Afghanistan. Whether this is going to be effective in Afghanistan, that's a separate question. For 15 years, the United States has spent $23 billion per year on this war, and they've found that there's been no strategic gains. In fact, one of the heads of the National Intelligence, Dan Coates, has recently said that the security situation in Afghanistan is worse than it's been, and it's likely, despite an increase in troops, to deteriorate further. So I think that, yes, you're right, there's going to be a big hammer brought against the so-called war against Islamic Fascism or the war against terror, whatever the au courant phrase is now in Washington, they'll bring a big hammer down, but whether this hammer will be able to hit any target as opposed to merely killing civilians is hard to say.
Well, I think that's what the whole phrase fighting without restraint means. The restraint is about don't kill too many civilians. And Trump is saying fight without restraint. That means don't worry so much about killing civilians. And I think we've already seen some sign of a change in that kind of strategy, have we?
Well, look, the use of the so-called mother of all bombs in eastern Afghanistan was one sign of this. Trump has been eager to so-called hand over operational decisions to the military and to cut back on some of the Obama-era restraints. You know, for instance, you might not, people may not know this, but the Taliban is not actually listed as a terrorist organization. It's listed as an insurgency. And during the last phase of the Obama administration, there was an attempt to actually go and push the Taliban significantly to the negotiation table, so that Mr. Obama in 2010 increased U.S. troop size in Afghanistan to over 100,000 U.S. troops. But that surge didn't actually work. They were not able to bring the Taliban effectively to the negotiation table. And so, at the end of that, Mr. Obama decided to start drawing down U.S. troops, seeing no utility in a major military escalation. And he also asked the military not to target the Taliban directly. In other words, to concentrate fire on ISIS and other extremist organizations, not the Taliban. This is a very interesting strategy, and we don't have time to get into it. But needless to say, it hasn't, of course, worked. The Taliban has increased its control of about perhaps 40% of Afghanistan, and the various extremist groups, 35 or so of them that operate on the Afghanistan and Pakistan border, are still seized of the opportunity to grow their base. So, that hasn't succeeded, nor indeed, I think, will it return to the strategy of having a large troop presence in Afghanistan. Something other than that is necessary. For instance, putting perhaps a little more pressure on Pakistan to reconsider its support for some of these groups on its border.
Yeah, I think your point about the convergence of interest between a Bannon-esque war on global fascism, which has even some metaphysical character. We know of Bannon's connection with the far-right section of the Catholic Church, Opus Dei and such. But the military side, the military leaders who may or may not share this religiosity of the crusade, they also are very upset, many of them, with what happened in Iraq. They say the reason they lost in Iraq is because of this restraint. And they didn't have to be, they should never have left. Obama should never have pulled the majority of the troops out. And it's very much a question of the honor and dignity, but even more so, the need for America to project its power, and people should tremble in their boots at that power. And Iraq did not send a very good message in the same way Vietnam did not send a very good message. And there's an interesting story in Vietnam, which is during the war, Lyndon Johnson, it became clear to Johnson that America could not win the war in Vietnam, but Johnson was very dedicated to not losing the war in Vietnam. It could not look like a debacle. And there's even a story at one point talking about a pissing match that apparently Johnson actually pulled out his organ, and I guess people can get what organ it is, pulled it out in the White House as an example of how America would win this pissing match. And as a result, in the end, 1.5 million people died. Well, I think for people like John McCain on the political side and much of the military leadership, Iraq is not a settled story. They don't think people should have pulled out, the army should have been pulled out. And they don't think the idea that American military can be defeated in the Middle East, either in Afghanistan or Iraq, is something they want to sit with. So I think there is quite a convergence here between the Trumpian, Bannian view and what the Pentagon and the war hawks, neocon war hawks, want.
Well, look, whatever America's power elite, whatever their psychological problems, I think it's grotesquely unfair that their psychological problems have to be acted out against the civilians in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. perhaps up to 1 million people in Iraq, in Afghanistan have been killed in this long 15-year campaign. The official numbers, I think, are very deflated. Officially, they say that about 31,000 Afghans have been killed. I think this is a ludicrous number. The numbers that come from the ground are much higher. So the price that's being paid by the Afghans, I think, is way too high. I don't personally think there's going to be any kind of easy military solution in the region. Right after 9/11, the so-called Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is basically the region's powers, had said that they would like to get involved and hold some kind of regional, deliberative, very enforceable strategy to bring some sort of stability inside Afghanistan. This would include having, for the very first time, some border discussion between Afghanistan and Pakistan. It would include the question of the regional ambitions of various extremist groups, etc. So I think there are various regional solutions that should be part of the conversation, but they are not. They are often eclipsed by this idea that if you wield the hammer, you can get results. And, our history has shown us that wielding the hammer merely breaks things. It doesn't necessarily bring stability and peace.
And it's a very dangerous moment right now. I think one lesson Trump can draw from his first 100 and so days is that the one time he had the heat taken off him on this supposed Russia agenda or Russia connection was when he bombed the airbase in Syria. All of a sudden, according to Fareed Zakaria, and even Chuck Schumer was out there cheering, he became president that day. So it's a very dangerous moment because his way out of all the current political chaos and crisis is to have a good war.
The more you tell somebody that when you bomb, you're being presidential, the more you encourage them to use the military to earn high poll numbers and to earn the plaudits of the intelligentsia. I think it's very dangerous and irresponsible for people such as Schumer and Zakaria to come out and say those things to Trump, because it merely encourages him to use a military solution and to basically not only avoid, but to disparage other solutions. There has to be, I think, a calling to account of people who use armed force and, and basically set aside other options that are on the table. I think it's important for us to remind people that there are always other options as opposed to armed force, and those other options are always set aside when you go in for this kind of surge or escalation or this kind of talk about winning, as if winning was so easy.
Right. Well, CNN isn't very interested in covering solutions. Right now they're making a fortune out of attacking Trump, but nothing makes money for CNN like a good war. Anyway, thanks very much for joining us, Vijay.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.